Everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, May 30th, 2019 meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. Roll call, please, Ms. Ellison. Commissioner Fisher.
Here.
Commissioner Staunton.
Here.
Commissioner Brindle.
Here.
Commissioner Anderson.
Here.
Chair Hovland. Here. We have a form of meeting agenda in front of us this morning. Director Neal, is there anything you want to modify here?
There is not.
All right, okay, we've got a form of meeting agenda. Is there a motion to adopt a meeting agenda as shown?
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion second to adopt a meeting agenda as shown. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? Carried. Community comment. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to address the HRA on a matter of concern to them that's not otherwise on the agenda this morning? All right, seeing no one coming forward, we'll move on past community comment. And we have a consent agenda in front of us. There's a couple items on the consent agenda. Is there anyone on the HRA who wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the consent agenda as shown.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion second to adopt the consent agenda as shown. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. And then we are on to reports and recommendations. We're going to have a little conversation this morning about the Grandview site, and the introduction is going to come from Scott Neal, and then we're going to move on to Kerry Teague, and then to our presenters. So, Manager Neal.
Thank you, Your Honor. We are here again to have a discussion with the HRA about the future redevelopment of 5146 Eden Avenue, more commonly known to us, I think, as the city's former Public Works Maintenance Center. About a three-acre tract just on the other side of Highway 100. This site has been something we've spent a considerable amount of time on, both as a staff level, as a council, planning commission, and as an HRA. And at the last time that we discussed this was earlier this year, when we had a brand new council member, and at that point we decided to sort of leave it and give you some time to think. We've recently had, however, an expression of interest, some outreach from our former kind of official development partner for that site, Frauenschuh Company. And Frauenschuh has as a project or has a concept that they would like to speak with us in a more serious manner about. And as we had a chance from a staff perspective to listen to it, we think it may have some merit and that you may have some interest in it. The question is, we don't have any current direction from the council or HRA on what we ought to do with this site, because when we left this conversation the last time, we decided to just kind of let it be for a while. So before we go through the process of sitting down with them and identifying, negotiating processes and parameters, we thought it might be wise to just try to get a sense of where the HRA is on 5146 Eden Avenue, or excuse me, 5146 Eden Avenue. Is it, when you think of this site, are you ready to move it ahead to a specifically identified project with a specifically identified partner? Would you prefer to start from scratch and have an open process? Would you like us just to put a for sale sign on it and sell it? Where are we on that subject? And if we're not anywhere new on it, that's okay. That will give us some guidance in how we talk and how we deal with the current kind of Frauenschuh discussion. But if there has been some development in the way that the five of you think about it, and if there is a consensus among the five of you, it would be good for us to know that, because I think when we think about this particular site and this probable concept, it will require a significant dedication of time and probably money, and certainly council HRA time if we're going to pursue it. So that's where we are today. We wanted just to raise this question with you to try to see if there is a consensus, and if there is, what it is, and we would certainly from a staff standpoint adapt to it and move forward with that. So that's my intro, Mr. Chair.
Good, thank you. One note before we move on. talked to the city manager, executive director, and we thought we'd shoot for being out here at 8:30 today. So we're going to turn to Kerry Teague now. I think has some further backgrounding he wants to do, and then we're going to hear from our former partner, Frauenschuh Company.
Sure. Just briefly, to let you all know what the concept is. So what Frauenschuh is considering here, or would like to pursue, is a similar project to the one that they had originally proposed. It's slide 14 in your packet, with a few modifications. So with the high-rise building on the north end of the site, they would modify that to be in the 10 to 12-story range, and it would be a senior co-op concept. The liner housing along Arcadia would remain, and with the parking underneath and the green space on top, that would remain as well. That would be dedicated public space on top. Where the Arts Center sat on the south end, what they would propose would be a 60,000 square foot medical office building, and they would reserve a spot potentially for the city to do the fire station or EMT facility. They have indicated that they would meet the affordable housing policy. They would provide 10% of the units, either a combination of within the liner building and the senior co-op facility, or all within the senior co-op. They haven't done any specific design work. This is more exploratory to find out what you're all thinking on that. But that's the plans that they're at least conceptually thinking about.
Okay. Good. Questions for Director Teague at this point in time? Further comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would add really that we haven't set this up as a sketch plan review or as a bilateral negotiation between the HRA and Frauenschuh from the dais. We didn't do that because we really haven't had substantial conversations with them that have gotten to that level yet. In order to get to that level, we wanted to have a sense of where you were on it. So we really were hoping this would be more of a dialogue among the five of you, and we could take some direction from that.
Good. Did our folks want to, our former partner, Frauenschuh Companies, David Anderson, Dean DeVolis, want to present your ideas? That might help guide the discussion a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Dave Anderson with Frauenschuh, and glad to be here this morning. Dean DeVolis here as well, who has been with us along the way studying this site for some time, along with the HRA and the council. And I think Mr. Neal framed this up well. The conversation here today is just that, a conversation about continuation of some components that may fit with some of the physical plan elements that had great potential for the site. We've continued to analyze, continued to study, but I want to make sure you also understand we were partners and worked through, as you recall, looking at a lot of different scenarios, some of which would be, keeping the site entirely public, some of which were approaching it with a portion of public ownership and private ownership, and then options for perhaps just in developing the site entirely private. So we understand that exploration. We understand that that's where things have been up to this point. So we wanted to do just that today, is have a conversation about a very important site, a catalyst site, and we've always viewed this as that, to also meet the mark on some very direct community needs. In January, when the HRA Council talked about public needs and the EMT functions, that seemed to spark a bit of interest in how we could view the site in a way to accommodate that. So we'll talk a bit about that this morning amongst these mix of uses. So I think here today we're here to have conversation. Dean will walk you through some of the plan elements Kerry referred to, and happy to answer any additional questions.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
Thanks.
Mr. DeVolis, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm going to
Why
give
don't you identify yourself for the record,
yes, sorry.
please?
Dean DeVolis, DJ Architecture, 5009 Ridge Road, Edina, Minnesota. And I'm going to give a quick walkthrough of the plan and how it may modify to accomplish the new uses. We believe because this plan did go before a sketch plan, was discussed that, and it actually went before a planning commission too, that the major elements were well received in terms of the basic idea of the town green, the grand stairs, the future connection that could tie to Jerry's, and the future idea of the bridges. And our intent is to keep that, because that was the strength of the plan. That really created an interest to it. So what's really evolving is the uses, that this component will become a senior co-op, which will be maybe closer to 10 to 12 stories in this area. The liner housing would remain, could be rental and or townhouses. The senior co-op will contain affordable housing and potentially this section also. The bottom part, which was the Arts Center, will become a 60,000 square foot medical office building. If you remember, this original Arts Center was drawn closer to 30,000 square feet. So this site can handle that building quite nicely. And then where you see this dark area, it would become potential for a EMT location, which is well centered to serve the western part of Edina. So the site really sets up well to contain the new program uses, but keep the original urban design aspects that it have and sort of allow it to be a catalyst. And again, same idea, this component of parking being the senior co-op, this component supporting the medical office building and the public uses above and the liner housing that occur along Arcadia. And then just going up the floors right here. So using this diagram, imagine this now is a medical office built to empty, it'd fill more of the site. This would remain basically the same. This would probably be closer to 10 to 12 story senior co-op building. The same connectivity as described in this plan would remain in that aspect to keep that connection. So those attributes are, I'm going to say, locked in. This is just showing a view again describing this medical office building, this component being the senior co-op, this being the liner housing, EMT where this notch is, this location, and then these elements basically staying the same to keep that same connection with Park and start making that bridge between Our Lady Grace up to Arcadia and then obviously connecting Jerry's and letting this site really become a catalyst to what hopefully be the future Grandview redevelopment. Again, just a view from the other side of the project. And again, a view showing where the medical office building would be, where the liner housing remain, and this being the senior co-op, probably more at this height, more of a 10 to 12 story building. And again, the urban design concepts of the connectivity and alignment of the streets. So that's it for a presentation. We just want to give a quick high level overview and what we hope in the discussion we talked this through. And if council sort of sees a valid vision that we get a direction that starts maybe a joint effort between staff and ourselves to refine this and bring this more forward as a detailed plan, if this makes sense to council. Thank you.
Okay. I had one quick question, and that was, I'm going to turn to my colleagues after that, but in the past, we've talked about this site as being partially owned by the public, partially owned by the private sector. Over at 7200, 7250, we did something a little bit different over there. It's all privately owned, but there's public access as opposed to public ownership. And I'm wondering if you've given that any thought relative to this site, this 3.3 acre site, as that being a potential model that involves less public commitment of financing because, or funding, because we ran into that obstacle with the Art Center. I think it's at about 40 million.
Thank you. Absolutely. And Michael Sertu could further elaborate on that. That is basically the thought or thing, because 7200 was I'll say really a great cooperation council staff and a developer. It really came up a unique model in Edina which created public use using TIF to help make that happen in a private development setting. And that really has worked out well in a lot of aspects, ranging from affordable housing to public place to presence and so forth. This is the same idea we're thinking of approaching this with on the basis, and the things that help going forward, adding another major private component of the 60,000 square foot medical office building gives more private sector oomph to it on that basis, where before we were just having the apartment tower try to carry the whole site. Now with that additional use, that makes it more feasible in using the idea of call it a private sale, and then working with tax immigrant financing, LCD, other sources to help weave in all this public component with it would be a great asset. And this site, sort of given, at a cursory level, probably have the same ratio of public access to private at a 50-50 ratio, given what it's starting to look like. And that same thing, very similar to what 7250 France has. Michael, you have any comments to elaborate? Okay, so that's the basic thought we're looking at.
Okay, I've got more questions, but I'm going to turn to my colleagues first. And, Commissioner Anderson had some thoughts, I think, a few months ago about senior cooperative housing, and I think we've got a common view on the idea that, at least the two of us, on the idea that senior housing or senior co-op may be something that we could really use in our community. I don't know, Commissioner Anderson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree with that. Just a few comments, introductory comments. At a work session that Mr. Neal just referenced, in the last 3 months, I think, came more or less to a consensus that we wouldn't be taking much action on that site at this time. And that discussion more or less centered on the fact that we used an evaluation when that site was taken out of service in that conversation at about $4 million. We also used as a current valuation $11 million at this time. Now, my numbers show me that that's a return to the city of about 175% of equity. And that period of time, it comes out to almost 20% annualized per year. So that's a very well-performing asset, well-performing public asset. And I think that our basis, of course, is much less than that. And then we also discussed the possibility of a new firehouse on that site, which this conversation is inclusive of. So, those conversations, combined with the fact that we decided at that time not to move forward immediately, at least, or questions for me. We've not yet seated the Housing Task Force, so their work isn't available at this time for extended conversation, and that won't be available until fall at the earliest. And we have no report from the Housing Needs Analysis, which we agreed to engage. So I recognize that especially my colleagues have spent a tremendous amount of time and energy and work trying to figure that site out. And so I think that's been kind of a wrestling match over a long period of time. I don't have the familiarity with it or considered all of the possibilities that you all have over the course of time. I think that's been kind of a deal. I do think that a housing component on that site is extremely useful, and I couldn't agree more that a senior cooperative is, I believe, a demand need in our town at this time. I think, as a matter of fact, that there is a connection between preservation of single-family housing, which can be more affordable to young families if we structure the financing of this correctly. I believe that there's a possibility to subsidize or help people moving into the affordable housing aspect of a senior co-op, which can relate to that. My experience is, if done properly, again with the right financing, a senior co-op is affordable in any event. And I think that we can do 60 to 80% for sure, without question, all through a senior co-op. That's been my experience. One of the things that happens with a senior co-op is you have equity retention for people of a certain age. That's important. When we take a look at rents today, $2,500, $3,000 a month, that's a lot of money, I think, for someone on a fixed income. So that's why I believe so strongly in it. And I also believe in the concept because if you've ever toured 7500 York, for instance, but if you go through any one of a number of senior co-ops, you find that they are impeccable. And the reason for that is that nobody owns a unit. We have joint ownership in a building, in a cooperative where people are involved. And what you see is when people walk down the halls, if there's a piece of paper on the floor, they don't call maintenance. They pick it up. We take care of our property. The most important part of that is that socialization and nutrition is addressed in indirect ways. People keep an eye on each other. That's important as people age, because we want to age in place. We do age in place. And so this type of unit fitting in there, I think, is important. I did a little homework and went back through some of your work over the last several years. I took a look at surveys, and I took a look at participation, what's come forward. The thing that jumps out at me is that over and over, I saw interest in a community center. We don't have a proper community center in our town. Right now, we're leasing the 4th floor of Normandale Elementary. I don't believe that is particularly well city supported. It serves as a community center of sorts. I think we need that. Other cities have been able to create community centers. We've struggled with it. We haven't really been able to embrace that at this time. So I believe that's because we struggle with the bonding. It's an expensive proposition, depending on the components that go in. If there's a huge fitness area, if we're including pools and so on, which I wouldn't necessarily think is critical for a community center on this location. It's a missing piece, and I think we're a little under the bar in that. I also I take a look at the work of our Race and Equity Commission, and I can see that they are very focused on a fitting naming event in the Grandview area for BC and Ellen Yancey. I can't think of anything that would be more appropriate than to be breaking ground on a community center on the Grandview site that recognizes BC and Ellen Yancey. I think that's a very good use. I'm looking at page 16 here, and I see the mid-rise concept study, and this was done 2018. Some formulation of this I think, could be a workable plan in here. We control the site. I believe that as we consider it, whether it's today or we wait for the work of the Housing Study Analysis as well as the Housing Strategy Task Force to come in, whether we consider that now or consider it then or we consider it down the road a little bit, I think those components are really, really important to recognize just based on the fact that this is a public asset at this time. And so to simply pull the equity out to go invest it elsewhere to create these public realm amenities, it seems like we're kind of chasing ourselves around a tree in doing that. That's my first impression. And since this is a time for conversation, I guess that's it. So thank you very much.
Good. Yep. Thank you. Thanks for those thoughts, those preliminary thoughts. Member Brindle, Commissioner Brindle.
Thank you. Inasmuch as we are waiting for information about housing and advice about housing from both the task force as well as the needs analysis, I'd also like to know if a fire EMT station is placed on this site, how much space do we need for it? Just looking at the proportion of the site, what was identified seems awfully small for if we're going to have fire stations that are kind of equally positioned, then I'd be curious about the size. I mean, I think we've heard that the that Fire Station 2 at the Southdale site is too small, that it's not appropriately located, and I don't know how you'd fit that station into what seemed to be a small area of a parking lot. It didn't seem like there were more than maybe 30 to 40 parking places in that area. So I'd want to know that, because I wouldn't, if we thought that this was going to be a good location for Fire Station 3, I'll call it, then we need to know what kind of space is needed for that before we decide how much of that site then we would portion off and say that's for private development and we're going to hold this for public use in the future. As to the uses on the site, that is a discussion that just is swirling. And one of the greatest challenges is the community center. We don't have one. Our folks go to all sorts of different locations for what they want to get, whether it's fitness or whether it's connectedness or whatever it might be. They go all sorts of places. And so do we want a single community center, or are people finding what they need by going where they go? I don't know. I know that Bloomington is beginning their task of determining what their community center would be, and that's a heavy lift for a community. Eden Prairie has a very successful community center, and I think, was that built while you were there? Okay, so we have a resource on how that happened, and how they continue to get people coming in the door, and who, how it supports itself. But as for a community center, we definitely need, if we're going to have one, we definitely need something different than what we currently have. Because it would be nice to have a great place to get together and meet and greet. And the challenge is that it needs space. It needs space for the facility itself, and it needs space around it for outdoor activities, as well as just the need for parking, et cetera. But whether it's time to consider another concept or reconsider a retooled concept for the Grandview site, I guess I'm open to it. I'm open to listening to anything, but I'd want to. I think just having that new element of Fire Station 3 in here makes me want to get more information about that before I can tell you whether this is something that I would consider.
Let me go back. I'm going to ask you to address this question, Commissioner Brindle. I'm going to go back to Commissioner Anderson just for a moment. What about this notion of having a model similar to 7200 to 7250, as opposed to what we've been trying to do on this site, have clearly public ownership on a portion of it and private ownership on a portion of it? And that I had as a genesis with a group of folks where both Commissioner Staunton and Commissioner Fisher were involved. Do you have any preliminary thoughts, one way or the other, as to whether we should look at variations on theme or on history in terms of how this site might be owned?
I guess I would look at it as, what are the uses that would be public? And at this point, I would hope that there's public parking. And if the green plaza above the parking is for public use, I'd look at it as, is that a public entity that then is used also by the seniors, by the residents in townhomes and by the folks in the medical office building in this particular example. So,
You've got some flexibility on your
yeah,
thinking there, it sounds
I
like,
do.
depending on
I do.
uses.
And
Okay.
so if this is preeminently a public space that we have private use around, and that public space supports that private use by giving it parking, by giving it some outdoor space, then I guess I see it as possibly being two owners.
Okay. Or what about the situation like Centennial Lakes, where near the Centrum, where the public have access to the parking, but it's privately owned? You know, all those strip malls are, and I think that parking is privately owned there.
And the parking is privately
Yeah.
owned. Yeah, that's another
That's another
example.
possibility
Yeah,
of-
yeah, absolutely, that's another
You're
example.
open-minded about
Yeah,
going either direction on that.
yep.
Commissioner Anderson, any preliminary thoughts on ownership structure? You feel strongly about whether the public ought to own part of it or at least have access to part of it?
Well, I think the access is very important, yes. In my experience, when I heard a discussion of TIF in order to create the public realm benefit that might exist there, in my experience, at least with senior co-ops, it's an ownership model. So there's really no need for tax increment financing, at least in that aspect of it. So the money, actually, if you said whatever your valuation per site is, whether it's $30,000, $40,000, or some other number per site in a multifamily setting like that, those dollars are coming out. They're going to come back to the city, and that would happen immediately. And there'd also be a tax base there that also starts to pay the city back immediately on that, as opposed to pushing out into the future. That's one of the reasons I think that the affordable housing ownership model, which is elusive and very difficult to solve for, is so desirable. And so as far as access to the site by the public beyond that use, it depends on what the other use is, to me. If we find a way, make a commitment to a community center there, and I get it, that's a big hurdle. It's expensive to do. I get that. Sooner or later, we're going to have to come to terms with it. I'm sure of that. And I'm not certain that there's going to be a better opportunity than we have here today, with very little expense to the city nestled into the site, but already, depending on the housing component, already a return that begins to come out of it, which can serve to offset that. We also have, as Commissioner Brindle mentions, scattered site access to various activities. To the degree that those can be incorporated into a community center, I think that's positive, because it would also relieve expense at some of these other things. Now, I don't think, frankly, that you can or necessarily should try to mold everything into a one-size-fits-all community center. I think that the size can actually be reduced and still be really, really outstanding, that can tie into use of the housing component, may also house other uses like a fire station.
Okay, good.
Probably
Thank
a
you.
longer answer than you were seeking.
Yeah,
but
no,
thank
that's
you.
good. That's helpful. I think it's helpful to everybody to hear these thoughts. Commissioner Staunton?
Well, I appreciate the comments from Commissioner Anderson and Commissioner Brindle. I agree with a lot of what was said. I do think I appreciate especially, Commissioner Anderson, your perspective as somebody with a fresh set of eyes on this. Commissioner Fisher and I, when we were on the Planning Commission, first approached the City Council in December of 2009 with an idea to put together a community engagement process to talk about the direction for this site. At the time, what was on the table, what had most recently been on the table, was a medical office building and a parking ring. And so it is funny how these things come full circle. One of the things I'm mindful of is the last 4+ years of my experience on the HRA and on the council has been a tumultuous time, in part because we didn't have plans about the direction we were going in various places, and the market came to us and said, you know, there's opportunities, and so we had to navigate our way on the fly while we were planning. But we're in a nice place now in that we are on the brink of finalizing a comprehensive plan looking forward. And really, the comprehensive plan, the big heavy lifting of the comprehensive plan has been these small area plans that have been a community engaged process to get interested stakeholders, residents, business owners, property owners to think about the future of various nodes in our community. And the first of those really was the Grandview small area planning process that came up with the development framework. We subsequently adopted a transportation plan. And it's a little different than the others, but each of them have their own personality based on how they were developed. And as Commissioner Anderson points out, you know, pretty significant portion of the concept behind the small area plan for the Grandview area was a community center of some type. And my recollection is the last time this came in front of us, what we said was, we are still interested in a community center, but we may be trying to put a round peg into a square hole, or vice versa, whatever the metaphor is. And that what we ought to do is put some work into figuring out what we wanted for a community center / art center. Instead of insisting that this be the site, figure out what we'd like to do and where, and then we could figure out the right site for it. But I'm very reluctant to let go of this site before we figure that out, because I agree with the comments that have been made earlier about the need for a community center and need for a new art center. I know in our conversations with the Arts and Culture Commission, they have expressed interest and enthusiasm for a new home for the Arts Center that could also be part of a community center. I have talked at length and to everyone's boredom about you know, kind of a one front door approach to community center, that it doesn't have to be the place where everything happens, but it should be the one place where everybody knows they can go to find out what is happening. And I still think that this site is a possibility for that, and so I'm not really interested in moving away from that. I also agree with the comments about the Housing Task Force. This is a site that we control. As Commissioner Anderson pointed out, we don't seem to be losing money on the asset as it sits. So, and the fact that we haven't even got the housing project next door completed yet, and it's going to take a while to digest that and figure out how that's going to all work with the transportation infrastructure around it. That makes me think it's okay to measure 5 times and cut once. And then I also, this fire station notion is, to me, you know, that comes out of the blue. I know we've talked about the need for something in this area, but that is not any part of the Grandview framework or the transportation plan. So if we're going to make a dramatic change in direction with that, I think we need much more community engagement before we're going to make that call about whether that's the appropriate place to put something like that. So I'm not inclined to move forward at this time with a change in direction. And if we ultimately decide on a change in direction that is not going to include the major components that are part of the development framework, I think we need to revisit the development framework and have a community engagement process that helps us guide the future direction of this. Because as important as the planning is, following the plans that we have crafted is really important to the credibility of that. So my intuition is to sit tight, but to redouble some efforts on this Arts Center, Community Center business. I know I've had conversations with a variety of stakeholders in that interest, and you know, I think we need somehow as a council and as a HRA to figure out how to give direction to people in the community to come up with some momentum on that front. So those are my thoughts, Mr. Mayor.
All right, good, thank you. Commissioner Fisher?
So, thank you for bringing an interesting idea to us. It's not your first interesting idea, certainly not on this site. For the record, I think you sort of pointed out what I believe has been the best urban design solution for this site. Of the many, many, many solutions that have, or ideas that have been shown on this site, I've always believed that one on, was it page 14, is the one that really had the kind of fine grain that felt like it could create sort of an urban environment that we'd all imagined from the beginning. So I guess the question has always been, what goes in those boxes, those fancy boxes that make up that urban context? And, I think there's a lot of strength in the idea of a senior co-op, but even a decision like that, as you just sort of ponder that, sets a direction for a neighborhood. It's a great use, and I believe that we need more of that in our community. It's just a hunch, right? And we got this housing task force that we hope to get started, but by putting specific senior housing on this site, as an example, we are solidifying a direction for this neighborhood that maybe, most people would say, well, we're already there. Don't worry about it. It's just one more building. But those are the kinds of things we need to think about. The idea of bringing medical office back, like Commissioner Staunton said, is sort of a full circle idea. But again, some potentially great merit there in that that shared parking, then, that's a logical daytime parking, and then you have community uses, nighttime parking, that all works fine. So while these are all interesting ideas, I'm not sure I want to put you through this anymore, because, or any of us for that matter, because we go off and we run into these, we study these great ideas when in fact we know in the back of our minds that we're not ready to take action on some of them. That's my fear. And in this case, we've actually added more slow to action items, right? So we've added in this idea of fire hall, EMT kind of thing. And I know, at least for me, I don't have enough information to know if this is the right spot or if it's a different spot. And I know what it takes to make those decisions, and I fear that that would be something that doesn't meet sort of the timeline of just getting development done. This whole housing task force, it's going to take a little time for that group to, well, first of all, we have to select the group. That would be a good starting point. So we are really not there yet. And then you add on top of it this issue of the community center that my colleagues have been talking about. And we've literally been talking about this the entire time, and we haven't found the right solution. I don't know if this site is the right solution. When I talk about that fine grain of the urban context, there are some components of a community center that fit really well in that fine grain, so the arts center kind of component or whatever. But if this community says we absolutely need a swimming pool and 3 gymnasiums, that doesn't fit here in my mind. It doesn't. That suggests big blank walls and the opposite of what we're trying to achieve in this spot. But what I know for sure is it feels like there's a lot of community conversation that has to happen around that. And the fact that we've been talking about it for 10 years and haven't figured that out makes me wonder how much of a drive is there really for this community center, and have we just not, what other ways can we approach this to figure out what the real demand is? I don't know. But what I know for sure is that it feels like in the last several years, certainly we've all put a lot of effort into this. And I felt like we kind of got out ahead of, these different decisions. And I just don't want to do that again. I don't want to do it to us. I don't want it to do it to you, because it's just a waste of time and resources. So I don't know, it feels like we need to take some sort of action and get some sort of direction here. Not necessarily right today. But maybe the best start is, we get the housing task force going and figure out some of those things. Though I don't think, we have to be very careful as we approach this housing task force that this small little band of people that we're going to cobble together aren't going to give us all the answers, right? We're just going to gather information and have sort of, but we have to be very clear, I guess, about what the expectation is, because if we think a housing task force is going to get put together and in a few months tell us what can work here on this site, that's not going to be our answer either. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I like this drawing on the start of your presentation, Director Teague. That aerial view it helps, I think, helps us see some of the challenges of the site. We had a traffic study done for the area. One of the things that folks are concerned about is the level of congestion in that area and how we move people around and how we move vehicles around. And so some of the thoughts I've had over time have been driven by transportation infrastructure. And I think one of the things you didn't mention in your presentation this morning, Mr. DeVolis, is that I think all of us on the council through the years have said we want to maintain access to the rail because we just don't know what's going to happen in the future with respect to rail. What to do with this site might have been a little bit easier if that we had that idea of the, I'll call it a deck park. Some people call it a lid, but where we had this sort of government plaza running from one side of Highway 100 to the other, where we would connect folks. What we end up now with, because we've set that idea aside, is we got a 3.3 acre site in a fairly dense area and try to figure out what to do with it. And in one sense, trying to minimize the level of congestion. And to me, senior co-op is a perfect example of what could go in there, where folks aren't using their cars much. They get to, as Member Anderson said, and I've heard from so many of them that are living over in 7500 York, they've been able to bank the equity in their homes and move into a co-op and be comfortable for the rest of their lives and not have to worry about any of worry about their financial future. What happens now is they sell their homes and they look around to stay in Edina, a place they've lived for 30, 40, 50 years, and they see that they can replace their 3,000 square foot home with a 1,500 square foot condominium if they can find a condominium for the same price, or they can go into the rental situation that Member Anderson's talking about, anywhere from probably 2,500 to actually 4,500 a month is the range I hear. So to me, this idea of senior co-op housing is really intriguing in that neighborhood, because then they'd have access to so many other things that they could walk to if we set this up right. Everything is there except a movie theater, really. Access to our, a great grocery store, drugstore, liquor store, our municipal liquor store. I mean, everything is cited there in terms of ease of access for everyday living. The public elements of it, we've had this conversation about a community center before, and it's really wonderful to think about having a community gathering place, but every time we look at it, it's a $40 million number and nobody's prepared to go there. And I don't think anybody in this town that served on the council thinks there's a failure in fitness. And the primary driver from some of the folks in our community were, with respect to a community center, they wanted something that was a big fitness center. And we don't need a big fitness center. We've got Lifetime Fitness that's about to embark on the state-of-the-art fitness center in the entire country. And I've just never been able to see a failure in the fitness market that would cause us to want to get into the fitness business. And as I went around town years ago with members of the council then, and we looked at other community centers that were all being subsidized to the tune of $250,000 to $800,000 a year by their taxpayers, it gave me great pause on what we should be doing in terms of a community gathering place. Nonetheless, I see the value in having different places where you can build a sense of community and people can gather. And I think one of the things about this idea is this kind of common element park, where I envision that as a place where in the summertime you could have a farmer's market, where you could have outdoor films, and it would be a wonderful place for people to walk to and gather. For wintertime activities, I'm not sure. One of the iterations we looked at was down on the corner with some indoor skating and maybe some curling or some other activities similar to what they've done out in Chaska. I agree with my colleagues that the amount of space needed by us for a fire station for our EMTs to be able to access, in particular, I think northeast Edina, is an important thing to be thinking about. I also don't know if this is the right site for that. I join Member Fisher in that. It's been over a decade. I guess the blessing here has been that while we've pondered what to do with this site, it has gone up in value, as Member Anderson points out, and it's quite a nice increase in value. But I'm kind of tired of waiting too, and saying, "Oh, we should defer this until we know this or we know that." Well, if that's true, then let's find out what we need to know. Let's go out to the community. Let's find out if they want to build a community center. Let's find out if they want to build an art and culture center. Because the last time we did a survey that I think that was comprehensive, it showed that people did want a community center, but nobody wanted to pay for it. So, I mean, that sounds kind of typical, doesn't it? I mean, in a way. And so you're left pondering what to do with this 3.3 acre site. And I'm getting tired of admiring the problem. It's been over a decade. And I think we should be thinking about what to do with it. And we should be thinking about it earnestly. So if it means going out to the public and doing a broad-based community survey, or it means going out with some idea that we pose to them on a referendum basis to do a community center, but let's think about something like that. Or let's turn to this other idea that's in front of us here, which I think is a pretty good one, because it's got a combination of senior affordable. It's got public access to a vast amount of the space, down at 7,200, 7,250. I think we're in the 43% range for public access. Here we'd be in the neighborhood of 50%. And I like the affordable housing aspects of it, whether it's and I actually like the affordable housing aspects of it, both in the Liner building and I like it in the senior co-op. I like it both places. I think it's important that we think about it both places, so that we've got a mix of challenges that we've addressed, so that are generational in nature. So you're going to end up with no firm direction here, because we've all, I think, still got those different ideas of what we want to see happen here. And I'd be comfortable going forward and exploring this idea, because I do think it meets the 7 guiding principles. But regardless, I don't know how to help you.
Well, Mr. Chair, one of my concerns about this discussion this morning was going to be that we would put that image up on the screen and then begin to critique it when we don't really have a proposal in front of you right now. The question we had for you is really more fundamental, and that is, do you want us to in a sense re-engage with Frauenschuh bilaterally and have a discussion about how to redevelop that site, just as if we were doing it a couple of years ago when we did have a partnership agreement with them? Or, and I'm hearing some interest in, let's finish the housing study. We control a 3-acre piece of land that could be critical in how we respond to that housing study, and then maybe re-engage in this question. Then do we want to do a negotiated bilateral deal with Frauenschuh, or do you want to go out to the market? Because what you saw today, I mean, Kelly Doran would like the same opportunity. Johnny and Grady from Trammell Crow would like the same opportunity. There's a lot of people that have expressed an interest in this site. And the question for you, not necessarily today, but certainly down the line, is how do you want to handle that? Do you want to have some kind of do you want to have multiple options, or do you want to focus in on a partner that we've had some experience with? That's that's a question that is important to us because the staff are the ones that are getting some of those questions on a fairly frequent basis from the development community.
Okay, I forgot one thing I was going to mention on the housing task force. I think it would be, I think the opinion up here, if you're here, is fairly uniform, that it would be important for the housing task force to finish their work so that we know, because I think what we're going to learn from that, from visiting with folks over in St. Louis Park, is that we're going to learn our baseline, what we have, and then we're going to learn, at least in Maxfield's opinion or somebody else's opinion, what they think we need or we're short of. We'll get those two elements, and then where those pieces go, I think, is another question. I think Commissioner Staunton raised a good question. That is, he's reluctant to let go of the site until we know what the uses are for the site. Well, you can do it that way, or you can ask people to come up with ideas for the site that you can evaluate, like Frauenschuh has done here, and then you can decide who you want to work with. But the only way, to me, if we're going to try to accomplish this public-private purpose on that 3.3 acres, and we want to figure out what we know, how do we know what uses are good for the site? The only way I can see doing that now is to go out to our people in our town and say, what do you want to see there? And how do we pay for it? Are you okay if we borrow money to build whatever it is you want to see there?
Mr. Mayor, if I could jump in, or Mr. Chair, I guess. To me, this community center notion is what's in the way. I mean, what we said back in the last time we looked at this is we weren't sure this was the right place for it, but we're not sure this isn't the right place for it either. And before we either let this site go or do something else with it, we should figure out that answer. And where, that answer will also include, based on what is included in it, what the right location for a community center, art center, or whatever it is. And then we can move forward with this site. So I know that is part of the arts and culture work plan. And I've had conversations with a variety of people about this topic, and I know there's some interest in folks pursuing this, but we have to, to me, that's what has to happen before we can figure out what we're doing with this site. The only other point I would make is, this site is not the only site in this area that would redevelop. That building on stilts across the street is ripe for redevelopment, and I'm sure the medical office is something that folks have their eye on there as well. So before we kind of jump to some other use on this site, we should think about the surrounding uses as well.
And Mr. Chair, I would say the same thing about the fire station. When we introduced that topic into this discussion, it wasn't we weren't telling you this is the location for a new fire station. We were saying we should decide that it is or it isn't, because we haven't decided it isn't. But the area, the locational study that we looked at gave us some general parameters about where a new fire station should be located, and those general parameters weren't specific to say it had to be located on this 3 acres. Our discussion was we should decide that it shouldn't be here or that it could be here, but and we haven't done that at this point.
Member Fisher.
I'm just going to act like the historian here for just a few minutes, but just
you can legitimately
especially
claim
for
that
our
right.
for our new commissioner or newer commissioner. So back 10 years ago, when the very beginning of the Grandview study, the very first iteration, we had this volunteer design team, and the very first sketch that was done actually showed the community center right kind of on the edge of the parking lot here. On this side of the highway, with the idea that all that freeway interchange stuff is really redundant and could go away. We could capture that land. The grade can allow parking below, so you can have transit buses pull in and have a transit center on Highway 100 with parking that shares with a community center parking lot. And that was the genesis for the connection across the freeway. It was a pedestrian connection, which then later turned into the lid. But that was really the genesis of that whole thing was to connect people across so commuters could pull, the buses pull off on the other side and you come up and over to the parking. But then the community center really has a place to stretch itself and be a community center. And the interesting thing, as I think back upon it, is that there were folks that were real proponents of a community center and are to this day, didn't like that idea because it seemed like it would take a long time to develop a community center over on that side of the highway. I mean, it could take like 10 years, so thankfully we picked the quicker route, so.
Well, how do we go about figuring out, we've kind of honed in on this community center idea, public use.
Yeah, I think
How do we do that?
I think we need to light a fire under this community center notion. What direction are we going to go? And are we going to have it? Are we not going to have it? What's it going to include and where is it going to be? Or, if we're not going to do something, then we know we're not going to do something, we can move forward. That seems to be, to me, what's in the way here.
Yeah, I hearken back to when we built the Braemar Dome, not the golf dome, but the larger facility to the north of the hockey rink. You could feel the pent-up community demand and need for that facility, and it seemed like the whole community, everybody that had kids in the district, wanted something that they could use on an indoor facility basis. I've never felt that on a community-wide basis with respect to a community center. I've felt it a little bit more extensively with respect to art and culture, that they needed something other than a leaky building along the crosstown. And I think that to me was always worthy of consideration. And I think with anything that could happen on this site, for example, it could still include art and culture at some layer. I mean, for example, if there was a commercial building, medical office, if it was 60,000 square feet, 20,000 foot floor plates, you can always add a couple more floor plates for an art and culture center. So to me, the art and culture center is an easier piece of the puzzle to deal with on this site. And I think it's a relatively good use on this site, although it does promote more traffic in and out. And I think that was one of the big fears of the community center, is that the traffic volume in and out of the place for events would be more than that area could sustain, even with some rejigging of the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure system. So that's why I personally came to evolve to some sort of senior housing where there was less traffic generation. But I'm still willing to look at this, however we define community centers. For me, it wouldn't include some vast athletic ability. I mean, it would be a place where people could gather, and maybe it's a art and culture center that has more expansive capabilities in terms of being a community gathering spot, whether it's black box theater or it's some kind of facility that would hold up to. We don't have a facility, for example, that's publicly owned where we can seat up to 1,000 people for performances. We do not have that, and I can sense that there's some at least periodic need for that from events we've had in the past. Years ago now, when we had Will to Explorer.
Steger.
Will Steger come, and we had to go to St. Pat's Church where they had a 1,000-seat sanctuary to be able to accommodate everybody that wanted to come and hear Will Steger talk about what was happening in Antarctica and what was happening with respect to global warming. At that time, it told me that there are issues and speakers that could come to Edina that would fill a 1,000-seat facility easily. And if we had some kind of regular Edina program, that I think we could easily fill it. I always thought about something akin to the Westminster Forum, where they pack that with national speakers. That's the kind of thing that is sort of in our wheelhouse, I think, just based on the interests of our residents. So I'm willing to look at that, but I'm personally not interested in the fitness aspects of it. There could be some classroom space for smaller, yoga type classes, I don't see the indoor pool. I don't see the big gymnasiums. That's why we built some of these. We improved some of the gymnasiums at Valley View and Southview. Because we thought it was better to do it on a decentralized basis, and why we improved the pool at Valley View, so we didn't have to absorb this or have our taxpayers pay the subsidy that other cities were paying to maintain these community centers. Now, if the attitude of the public has changed on that, then I'd like to know that too. So at a minimum, I hear that it's premature to be launching into a conversation with Frauenschuh or anybody else on what to do on this site until we get some of these preliminary questions answered. But these answers are long overdue, in my opinion.
And that we should give some thought from a staff standpoint about how do we go about resolving the community center question. We ought to get on that.
Commissioner Anderson.
Just that I think, in reflection on the last hour or so, this has been a really good opportunity and even a catalyst to begin to say, okay, what are we going to do here? And how do we deal with this community center question? So I really appreciate the time and thought that goes into this, so thanks for that.
Thank you. Well, we ran a little over. Is there anything else that we have on the agenda? Director Neal?
Just the final agenda items about comments.
Okay. HRA Commissioner comments, anyone?
Just a quick one.
Anything to share for the good of the community?
It's actually a council comment, but we're in the midst of student interviews. So thanks to MJ Lehman and Heidi Lee for coordinating that. And as always, some great young people who want to spend some time learning more about their city and providing their input to the city as well, so for direction. So it's always a fun project to get to know all these young people. So thanks, and I am going to miss the June 4th council meeting because I will be in Germany at that time.
Uh-oh.
And
I'll be gone too.
oh, really?
We are going to get some stuff done.
Yeah, I got.
Let's load up that agenda.
Yeah, what an opportunity.
So, yeah.
Don't put anything on the a 4/5 vote.
Now I got to look. Right. Okay.
Yeah, remember, I'm going to the Yale Mayor's College as an invitee of Yale.
Ah.
We should be okay.
As long as we're declaring such things, I'm actually going to miss the next HRA meeting for the State Economic Development Conference of all things. But, yeah, how ironic. So that's, 2 weeks from now, I guess.
Okay, so what do we, I see you furiously working on the potential agenda over there.
Yeah, we're good.
I mean, we talked about this. I didn't know if you'd remembered that I would be absent.
Yeah.
Because that's the day of one of the days of the college. I think there were like 25 of us that got invited by Yale on their nickel to come to actually it's at the Yale Club in New York to talk about issues that are pertinent to across the country for cities.
Yeah, I think we should be okay in terms of those sorts of 4/5 items.
So if we're in the midst of scheduling conversations, we got some materials on the housing task force, and MJ provided us kind of a magic black box way to evaluate those. I am interested in what my colleagues think about it, but I think it takes more of a conversation about how to populate that task force as opposed to feeding numbers in one end and coming out with a magic list on the other end. So I'd be interested, especially if we're not going to be able to have a full complement at the June 4th meeting, perhaps it's worth a special meeting for us to talk about how to populate that. I know when we did the Race and Equity Task Force, we kind of had a meeting where we talked through what the options and got each other's thoughts about what the best way conceptually is to populate that group, and then sift through the applications to figure out who the right people are for those various roles. So I'd throw that out there. I'm not sure how my colleagues feel about that.
I agree with that completely. I looked at it and I'm narrowing down. I'm down to about 20 right now. And I kind of look through it and say, okay, but what are we doing about this? And is this perspective represented? And how is this going to tie in? And how many points do I get for that? So I do think that's a really important and useful part of the exercise, but a conversation is equally important. So I agree.
Mm-hmm. I concur.
And the reason I agree so much with that is that this isn't, if it were just as easy as, here's, professional qualifications or here's whatever, but we want to have broad spectrum of ideologies, and we want a cross-section of people, and they may not all agree, but we won't know that based on a resume.
Shouldn't agree necessarily.
Yeah, right. We want that. That's what's going to be best in this task force. So
One of the other things I think that could evolve out of that conversation that I've been thinking about is seven an adequate number? I mean, because when you think about how you want to populate it, it may be that we need more than 7, but staff's also sensitive to getting it too large.
7, the magic number.
7. Yeah.
Centuries of experience.
Well, I think 9 would be okay too. We got a 9-person planning commission.
well, Commissioner Anderson says he's got it down to 20. Is that good, Scott? 20.
We could make 20 work if we have to. All right.
What did you say? What were you muttering?
We can make 20 work if we have to. I did want to say, so the process we engaged here was a process that was tailored to speed, right? It was to get people to volunteer and get them placed and get them going. If we do want to slow this down a piece, and it sounds like if that's okay, that's what we can do. We can do what we did for the Race and Equity Task Force. We can get a sense of who's expressed interest, and we've got that. We have a lot of interest. We can give you our staff feedback, which we have. But if you want to we stop short of the personal interviews. That takes a lot of time out of the process too. The Race and Equity Task Force, we were able to do it without personal interviews of potential applicants, and that cut
Right.
some time out of the process.
And I mean, if we're looking at not having a full roster for the June 4th meeting anyway, we'll probably bump to the June 18th meeting. And could we do I don't think we need to go through the personal interview piece, but I think we need to have a discussion among the 5 of us about what the important components are of representation on the task force. And
Agreed.
so I'd be in favor of a special meeting sometime between now and the 18th that then could tee us up. So we're only slowing it down by 2 weeks. That'll probably happen anyway.
So we'll talk to, I'll ask Jen Garsky to begin sort of getting a sense of what your calendars are between, now and the 18th of June to do that. Okay.
And Commissioner Fisher, was it the next HRA meeting that you were going to miss? Okay. I was thinking maybe we could use, if we didn't have HRA business, we could maybe use an HRA time slot.
June 13th is the date that I'm away.
Okay.
We'll query your schedules and find a spot.
All right. Okay. Anything else? You started a good conversation there. By going to Germany. Yeah. All right, folks. Thank you. HRA stands adjourned.